All right, I think we'll get started. So this is the Transitioning Larger Acres breakout session. So we have three fabulous speakers giving different perspectives on how they have transitioned larger acres. I think, depending on what the audience, how we want to bring this discussion, again, a lot of what we really see as value of these sessions is also to have audience participation and discussion. We can talk about just some of the challenges generally, not only of transitioning larger acres, but managing larger acres. So we have three fabulous speakers. Taylor Stewart, who has been growing food organically since he was a kid, has a wide range of experience, is based in Nebraska, New Jersey, Virginia, and Michigan.
Kalamazoo.
Kalamazoo, and they went to Purdue University, so a Purdue University grad. Second, we have Michael O'Donnell, who serves as regional manager with Belltown Farms, that supports farming operations in New York and western Nebraska. And Michael lives in Muncie, Indiana. Says the gorgeous Muncie, Indiana. I have not been to Muncie, but I will trust that it is gorgeous. And I know that Michael has a lot of experience in terms of managing diversified large-scale grain operations. And finally, we have Angie Coxworth, who was raised by German farmers on her family farm in rural Champaign County, Illinois, and then pursued a career in business in the Chicago suburbs, and now is back to her farming roots, and was transitioning from conventional to organic in Illinois. So some great examples of different approaches and how people have managed to make the transition. So I think, Taylor, are you going first?
Sure. Hey, you guys hear me okay? So a little bit, Michael and I actually work together. So we both fill a similar role with Belltown Farms. So in particular, I've got 3 farms, one in Michigan, one in Illinois, and one in Texas. The Texas farm is the last one to transition to certified organic, so we'll move about 2,800 acres into production this year on that farm, which will bring my total up to about 6,400 acres in production that have come online in the last 3 years. So we come in and kind of buy farms and kind of evaluate their potential, and then staff them and equip them and operate them, and move through the organic transition process where we only grow organically. So it's a little bit of a whirlwind usually, but it's a lot of fun, and we don't always make the right choices, but we certainly do make a choice, and then try to learn from it. So that's kind of...
You want to give more of your background?
Yeah. So I spent a little time in Nebraska on like a, kind of a pasture-based intensive grazing operation that did some organic grain and forages. Spent a little time in New Jersey on a couple of different farms, one which was certified organic, that kind of started with really as a blank slate, and we developed it up to about 850 acres, which isn't a whole lot by Midwest standards, but sure felt like a lot in central New Jersey. And then a little bit of time in research, and before I moved to Michigan a few years ago, I was running my own grazing business in Northern Virginia. So I've kind of bounced through the Midwest a couple of different places, and yeah, I love Kalamazoo, so.
Cool. Guess I'll go next.
Yeah, Michael O'Donnell, as mentioned, I live in Muncie, Indiana. And currently, Taylor's my colleague. I work as a regional manager as well with Belltown Farms. The farms I'm currently involved with are in northwest Nebraska. It's about 1,600 acres. It's all eligible for certification this growing season. And then a 1,200 acre operation in Hudson Valley, New York. Most of that farm is already organic. There's a few fields that are still in transition, and we're pursuing additional land to lease in that area that we would transition. I have an interesting path into organic farming, agriculture in general. Did not grow up in farming, don't hold any degrees in agriculture or related fields. I have degrees in mechanical engineering, worked in that field for a while, and in diesel engine control systems. That was actually my first exposure to agriculture of any kind. A lot of the the engines that I was working on end up in agricultural applications, case tractors, things like that. And I would go out to the field and troubleshoot engine control issues for the company, and went to several large farms out west. And but that was really my first contact with agriculture. But while in grad school, I started getting interested in agriculture from a lot of different, I was working in alternative energy systems and studying biofuels, and just had more and more questions about our agriculture system. And so my first actual farming experience was on it was small, and then moving into what I call mid-scale certified organic diversified vegetable farm in Austin, Texas. That's where I was going to grad school. If anybody ever knew of the farm Johnson's Backyard Garden in Austin, Texas, it sadly no longer exists. Kind of fell apart a couple years ago, but just a really neat operation that gave me my first exposure to farming, and I was kind of hooked from there. Spent some time on an integrated family-owned operation in West Central Indiana, near Crawfordsville, south of Crawfordsville. Not organic, but very diversified: cattle, pasture poultry, pastured hogs, grain crops, forages, and they had their own state-inspected slaughter facility and retail butcher shops in central Indiana. So kind of that whole, from farm all the way to consumer vertical integration. And then I spent almost a decade in the extension service, so working with Purdue University Extension. Got to know Aaron quite well, and we collaborated on a number of projects and programs and things together. I served first as a county-based ag educator in the county where I live in Indiana, so supporting, all agriculture is primarily conventional corn and soybean systems, not much livestock, a little bit of small scale, local food production work. And then I shifted into a state organic specialist role. It was the first time that position existed. I wrote the job description, worked with the extension director and some colleagues on that, and sort of shaping that role. And given that I was a single individual, I recognized pretty quick that the idea of being a support person for the entirety of the organic industry in Indiana really wasn't feasible. I mean, I just didn't have that much bandwidth, and kind of very quickly focused my efforts around organic field crops, organic grains. That was I think I started in that position in 2016. And most of the questions I was getting was from grain farmers interested in transition. And that was a big focus of the program, is offering programs to get people together in Indiana to learn from one another, because we didn't have any kind of base organic farming organization. The university or extension to that point really hadn't offered much in an organized way to support farmers in that space. So that's kind of where the program focused. I did get some acres at one of the Purdue research farms transitioned into organic. It was only 40 acres, but that I think tripled or quadrupled the organic acres in the Purdue University system. It's nothing compared to, the organic acres in the systems up here in the upper Midwest at Wisconsin and Minnesota, but it felt like an accomplishment to me to get that done. And it's being used currently for some organic grain research supported with an OREI, USDA OREI grant, so it's nice to see that being put to use. I left Extension sometime in COVID, during the COVID time, and went to work with a large grain operation in Northwest Indiana, Living Prairie Family Farms. When I joined, there were something like 200 acres already certified organic, and Jason hired me to basically help him get things organized and serve as another person to help him navigate the entire operation into certified organic production. And all that's left, I think there's one part of a field that's eligible for certification this year, but there's something like 4,100 acres certified in that operation. that one field had to get, or this one swath of one field that's eligible this year had to get retransitioned. It was at the end of year 2, and some roadside right-of-way spraying along the interstate drifted onto that land, and so we had to retransition it. But pretty neat to see that operation be a part of transitioning those acres. But yeah, now I find myself working with Belltown and involved with a couple of very different farms, learning on this one in Nebraska, working with pivots for the first time. Low organic matter, sandy soils under pivot versus the other side of the country in Hudson Valley, New York, rain-fed, and this year just incessant rainfall, and yeah, working in 2 totally different places. So yeah, that's my background.
Hi, I'm Angie Coxworth. I am a little different in that I grew up in Central Illinois, immersed in farming, but wasn't ever really directly involved except for walking the beans and being there on shelling day and all those fun things as a kid. But I had a brother, so he really was the guy that helped my dad. And it was our family farm that my great-grandfather came over from Germany, and my parents still live in the house that he built. I didn't get an education in ag. I got an education in business, and I moved away from the farm, and I moved up to Northern Illinois and started a career in business. And so when I decided to go into this, I had about 20 years of business experience working with my husband, who was sort of an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, really. We built up a couple of businesses and then from the ground up, and I was involved in operations, marketing, budgeting, contract negotiations, got into logistics a lot. And so when we sold the second business about 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to do something different. And I've always had an interest in nutrition, and had really kind of bought into when I started having kids, bought into the organic, eating organic food. And I thought, you know what, I've got this farming background. I'm going to invest some money into farmland. I will say at the time, I wasn't thinking I was necessarily going to grow organic food. I wanted to just buy some farmland, and I bought some down where my parents live, which is about 3 hours south of me, where I grew up, and thought, well, this would be an opportunity for me to work with my dad and my brother and expand our 150-acre family farm. And so I started I bought over 200 acres down there and started transitioning it without really knowing what I was getting into. Well, actually, I started farming it conventionally, and that is what actually brought me back to, like, okay, here's what conventional farming looks like. And so that's when I started asking the questions, like, why don't we start going to maybe less tillage, or no-till, or strip-till? And my dad's kind of like, I'm getting old, I've done this for a while, like, I'm not really looking for change. And then I finally said, you know what, I'm gonna go organic, stop putting chemicals on. And then my brother said, nah, I don't think I'm interested in that. So I found some other people in the area that wanted to maybe custom farm for me during the transition and give me some time to kind of figure out what I was doing, and I put everything in hay. And so that was my first experience with transition, because I ran into some hay people that kind of messed up my farm, taking the hay off, and didn't want to pay me, and all those fun things. And then I realized, this isn't working. I'm 3 hours from home. My family isn't working with me on this. So I sold that land and almost immediately bought some farmland closer to my home in DeKalb County, which, as it turned out, had been one of the first organic farms in that area, to start out. And now there was a lot more organic farming, but it had been that, and it had gone back to conventional. So it was my opportunity to kind of take this farm that had gone back to conventional for a decade and start transitioning it. So again, I came in there with 20 years of business experience, and I had, really nothing to go on except for just all of my, experience in operations. And I was very fortunate to find myself in an area that had a lot of established organic farmers around me. And that, I think, was a big deal for me, to be able to rely on those people, and allowed me to really go into this without investing anything in equipment to start with, and figure out what I needed to do along the way. So.
Could we, just out of curiosity, how many people are farming organically? I mean, I know we're sitting at an O-Grain conference. Okay. How many people are transitioning land actively? And from a scale standpoint, is, over 100 acres? Over 500 acres? Okay. Yeah, gotcha. So there's quite a bit of acreage in transition here, which is great.
And anyone just farming conventional and learning organic, if you care to admit it.
Hey, got some strong souls in the back, so, yeah.
Okay.
All right, maybe I'll ask you guys some questions. If I don't know, I don't want to butt in if you had other prepared comments. So
We had questions for each other, but
Sure.
get us started.
Okay,
No,
okay.
get us started. Yeah.
If you have questions, I'll get you started. So Angie had mentioned hay as being a strategy for transition, and certainly a transition period that 36 months, and it's 36 months from the last prohibited input. So depending on even how you might strategize your last conventional crop, in terms of deciding it would be a non-GMO crop versus a GMO crop, could only be potentially 2 years of kind of that low input organic input system, because it's 36 months versus 3 years. So definitely advice of for those of you that are really brand new at this to talk to a potential certifier and really understand the ins and outs of the certification process. Just curious about other, just the thought process in terms of strategizing what crops to grow in the transition. I've heard that sometimes it's actually can be easier in the transition depending on field history, because weed pressure is actually lower. So kind of just some of that thought process of what you might choose to grow during transition, how that might relate to field history or equipment availability. Alfalfa and hay is often the go-to, but especially if you don't have even a conventional alfalfa or hay market, might not necessarily be the obvious choice. So just wanted to get some thoughts in terms of farmers you've worked with, or other strategies in terms of choosing which crops to transition with.
Yeah, that's a really loaded question. But no, it's a great question. So it's something we're thinking about. And it's something we've talked about a fair bit, and it...
Local resources.
Right. And so,
markets.
There can be such a difference in where you are and what you've got available, what you can sell. There might be a premium. We've got a pretty good market where I'm at in Southwest Michigan for a non-GMO soybean. And so that kind of helps with the transition process. Not everybody has that locally, and you may not be even close enough to a small grain buyer or something, or it doesn't make sense maybe to grow corn in transition. But I know that depending on where you are and, forages, if you've got a dairy you can put something into alfalfa with, there's some economic considerations to it. I kind of think about some of the operational considerations as well. So, if you've got a significant expansion that's happening, if you're going from 500 acres to 1,000 acres to 2,000 acres, whatever it is, that's a jump in what it means to operate that farm. So your equipment changes, your people change, maybe you've got an equipment size change, and if you don't have that, skilled workforce that's familiar with operating an organic farm, and you kind of drop them in the first year and say, hey, by the way, now we're going to start cultivating a couple thousand acres, and let's go lickety-split, you can kind of have some rough times. So I tend to like to do a little bit of some operations in transition, just to kind of get some acres under people's belt and kind of get them trained up and understanding what to expect with a crop that has a lower value, so.
Yeah, I'll probably speak more from my experience working with Living Prairie Family Farm in Wolcott, Indiana. The farms I'm involved with Belltown in New York and Nebraska, I mean, I started with the company in May, and a lot of the decisions for the last cropping season were already in place in terms of crop plans. So it was more of me sort of managing those decisions and then decisions moving forward in the crop plan and for the fields that we have in transition and whatnot. So in working with the farm in Indiana, as I mentioned, when I came in, when I was hired into that operation, there are already about 200 acres certified organic. One of those, a leased farm, was already certified. Someone else previously had certified it. So he had only transitioned an 80 on his own, had another 80 in transition, and I think a 160 in first year. And then pretty ambitiously, I think the next year started around 1,200 acres in transition. And then the following year, there was the rest of the farm, something like 2,300 acres. So it was a very quick ramp up in what was getting transitioned. And some of that was just informed by the fact that, you know, he just wanted to be out of conventional farming. That was a goal he had, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come and farm for him. He had a lot of reasons that informed that decision making, not just financial reasons, just the way he wanted to farm and the farm that he wanted to raise his kids on. But took a lot of different approaches. You know, if I go back, you know, specifically to the question that Aaron asked of, you know, different cropping strategies to transition, we used a lot of different strategies. So some of it was plant winter wheat following, you know, the last conventional crop, say corn or soybeans, whatever was there. And frost seed. In transition, most of the farms would get frost seeded to alfalfa. So going in February, March with a air boom and just dropping alfalfa in when that ground is frozen and get that freeze thaw action, and typically ended up with fantastic stands. So then that full second year would be alfalfa or clover. Sometimes it was mixes of clover, and did not hay it aggressively. So some of the early transition farms worked with dairies that were located north of the farm, maybe 30, 40 minutes north, and they would come and custom harvest it, not aggressively. He kind of limited them to just a couple of cuttings, and otherwise would just clip it, mow it. And then that third year, come in and plant organic popcorn. So that farm has been mostly, corn acres have mostly been popcorn. So, you know, something like that, wheat, alfalfa, or clover, not hayed heavily, and then into first year organic popcorn was a typical strategy. Other fields, as he started bringing in more acres and needed to sustain more cash flow, a lot of fields saw a first year soybean crop. He had a lot of opportunities for non-GMO soybeans, great markets to the south, I think, into Lafayette and the Cargill, you know, just great basis and premiums for non-GMO. A lot of those acres were actually no-till, so planted, you know, a cover crop of rye. After that last conventional crop was harvested, no-tilled roller crimp soybeans into that. I think some of that carryover effect that Aaron was talking about made no-till soybeans seem, you know, super easy, you know, good yields, no weeds, you know, it was great. And then some of those farms would, trying to think, a lot of those, if it was tilled soybeans, we would then go to wheat, frost seed clover, or alfalfa, cheap alfalfa like Vernal, and then to popcorn. So typically all of them were set up to where that first year organic would go into popcorn. One thing we observed in these no-till fields, and this is one of those like what would you do different kind of things, is that
and I saw this on tons of farms in Indiana when I was working with Extension. I saw it over and over and over, and I'm sure people in the audience could speak to it, but even if you hit that rye perfectly with a roller crimper and you get a great kill, you end up with viable seed, right? So you have volunteer rye in your system now. So trying to plant a small grain after that becomes problematic, especially if you're looking for, food grade market, because you've got rye grown in your oats, you got rye grown in your wheat, you got rye grown in your barley, and your farm becomes what I've called a perpetual rye machine, if you don't manage it well. So in those cases, interestingly, we, some adaptive management, which we were talking about at the gathering last evening. It was like, okay, we've got this rye, and in some cases, like a thick stand of volunteer rye after those first year no-till beans were harvested. And it's like, well, okay, we're growing rye. And so we'd grow a rye crop. Frost seed clover alfalfa into it, harvest the rye, whether it's for the farm's own cover crop seed. We had the ability to clean some of that seed, sold a lot of it to conventional farms in the area for cover crop seed, or to other seed, companies looking for rye cover crop seed. And then rolled that into organic corn. On some of those soybean fields that were tilled, plant wheat, barley, oats, different small grains. Again, plant it with clover alfalfa, then roll into first year organic corn. At that time, a lot of the acres went into oats, and we happened to hit the market well. Those were conventional oats, and we ended up getting a lot of those oats sold at extremely high prices. I mean, when there was that real shoot up in oat prices, and I don't remember what year that was, it was after, Russia went into Ukraine. We saw a big spike. We were selling conventional oats, $9.50, and it just was fantastic. I mean, we had excellent oat yields, 130 bushel oats with basically no inputs. As a transitional crop, it was kind of luck, right? And then some acres, when we brought in the big chunk of something like 2,300 acres, again, to sustain cash flow, we did grow corn, soybean back to corn on some of those acres, just to sustain production and generate revenue. Again, had great access to non-GMO corn markets, non-GMO soybean markets, but that was extremely challenging. That was a ton of acres to be, for where the farm was at in terms of scaling up. Something that Taylor hit on, having the operational capacity to execute on those acres well was definitely stretching us thin.
And I think it really hurts in transition when that happens, right?
Yeah.
Like, the worst thing you want to do is screw up your transition, end up with a huge weed load, and then hit those valuable years of your first couple organic years where you really are wanting to make some money, bring some cash in, and bingo, you've got a big weed load that maybe has built up. So there's a balance, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
My first experience was with 300 acres. And again, I didn't have the labor lined up. I didn't have the equipment. And I was lucky to be in this neighborhood of organic farmers. So I was really thinking long term, like, what do I want to get out of this transition? I'm not going to be able to rely on chemicals for fertilizer or disease control, so I need to get the life back in this soil, because as I learned in my conventional farming years, it was really more about writing a prescription for fertility, and then growing that crop, or putting that on, mining it, and then putting on for the next crop and growing that and mining it. And so this was going to be more of a long-term thing. So I wanted to do everything I could to improve the soil, but I also, wanted to try to, make some money and learn something during this time. And so with that 300 acres, I split into 3 fields, and with the idea that at some point I'd even those out and have a third. But I ultimately wanted my first year to be all corn, all organic corn. So I set it up where I grew 2/3 of it in soybeans the first year, so that I could grow oats and right before the corn in the organic year. And I grew oats in the first year on the third field, and with the clover and alfalfa interseeded, and I let that just grow. I let somebody take one cutting off a portion of that field, but I left all of it on the field. I looked into growing corn during transition, but I just couldn't make, well, at the time it was $3 to $4 corn conventional. I just couldn't make sense of the fertility and the fuel and the labor that it would take to grow conventional and what it would do to the soil. And so it didn't seem like a good long-term plan for me to grow in corn, although, I can understand why people might, because it gives you an opportunity to kind of learn from that. So that's just how I approached it. And again, I was lucky to have a local organic farmer step up and say, look, I've got enough equipment to handle 300 acres. Let's work something out, and and basically we sat down and we worked it out where he did everything for me, custom. But I was there in the tractor and on the side, seeing when we planted, weed control, everything. So I was able to kind of really get an idea of what I needed to do going forward, and then I was able to ease into it, realize, okay, the first thing I need to do is I cannot rely on custom farming for weed control. So the first thing I need to do is get a tractor and a cultivator, and then just go from there. And I need to get somebody that knows how to do this, so, and can learn. So, all of that we've already talked about a little bit, and then the storage, obviously is a big part of when you go into the specialized grain market. The storage and logistics is definitely, a whole different ball of wax. I took that time. The only experience I had with grain storage and handling was my dad's corn crib and the local elevator. So I didn't, and everybody's coming at me saying, you need this, this, and this. And I actually found an engineer that built grain facilities like your local grain elevator facilities. But I went to him and I said, he was an engineer out of Ames, Iowa, and I just bit the bullet, and I spent a year with him because I had a whole spot where I could build something new and plan ahead for the future. And if I was going to do this, I was going to do this right and know what I was actually doing in the process. So I spent a good solid year just while I was in transition, just building this grain handling and storage facility on my farm, with the intention that long term, what I was going into this to be to run an organic farming operation, and ultimately to grow food grade grain. And so I built everything to handle that during my transition. So by the first year of organic corn, I had a facility to get all then I got the opportunity to spend that year figuring out all the things that weren't right with that, but that was kind of my experience. So I think I learned what a lot of the challenges were during the transition, and it gave me that time to prepare. But I think for me it was soybeans and oats, and with organic you get a lot of options, but there was local markets for non-GMO soybeans and oats, so it seemed like an easy fit for me.
I think there's kind of an agronomic component. That,
Yeah,
we're
right,
talking about
exactly.
economics.
What
we're talking
region are
about
you in?
how much money are you bringing back in, or how
Right.
much money are you losing? But, whether it's setting it up with a legume to hit a good year of corn in your first go-round, or if you are chopping a lot, like you might have a real good opportunity to have a dairy come in and do some chopping on some alfalfa. But if you're not bringing back what you're taking, you just want to make sure that you're actually truly, you don't want to mine too much if you have to replace it. And if you're not aware of what's available in your area for those nutrients to be, potash isn't potash anymore, right? You've got a different type of thing that you need to bring back in. You got to make sure you don't have the dust control mineral oil on it or whatever. So just because they're dollars in the door, if you're mining down some things in your soil, you can really hurt yourself longer term when you go to replace it. So there's kind of a few considerations, I think.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. That's become this fertility question, and where you're getting those resources has really come into very clear focus for me after my experience supporting the farm in Northwest Indiana that's close to a lot of livestock production. Accessing manure, composted manure was never an issue. I mean, most of the fertility on that farm in terms of just bulk fertility was from a layer operation. Had a great relationship with the guy who brokered that litter for that operation, and it was cheap, right? We didn't have to bring spreading in-house. Their custom spreading outfit was based about 5 miles from the farm. So it was great having that resource. We also tapped some other resources, but it was mainly litter, and the cost was not a challenge. Even as there was a little bit more interest from the conventional side of using litter as a resource, we didn't see a lot of appreciation in that cost. So it didn't become, a problem in terms of the bottom line. And where we were taking off hay and maybe taking more nutrients, it's like the litter was a reasonable cost for us and not an issue. But this farm I'm working with now in western Nebraska, extremely isolated. I haven't been in a more remote place, I think, in my life. And you'd think, oh, it's Nebraska, there's livestock, there's cattle operations, but it's mostly in that county, it's mostly just grazing. There's not feedlots nearby. There's no poultry operations nearby. And so the impact of bringing in the fertility resources that I need, whether it's composted, feedlot manure or litter from poultry houses, layer houses, it has a tremendous impact on the profitability of this farm, and finding, the freight, lining up freight, finding those resources that can make the cropping system work, or redesigning the cropping system so that you're not relying on as much bulk material in the form of manure and compost. You got to think creatively in that way. So I think if you haven't transitioned, or you're at the start of that process, I mean, it's all context specific, and you really need to be aware of where those resources are going to come from.
That's great points there, and great points about, and I hear a lot of debate about this, using alfalfa even as a tool within the organic grain rotation for bringing in nutrients or weed management, that it's nitrogen fixer, so you may be bringing in nitrogen, but you're potentially exporting a lot of potassium. So trying to pencil out kind of that mass balance inputs in and what you're extracting off if you don't have livestock to basically be recycling those nutrients back onto the field.
And I think there's actually, it can be, you can use that as a benefit too. So, you can look at it and say, hey, I know I'm going to be dependent on bringing in a lot of litter. I'm going to drive my K numbers up through the roof, and that's going to impact my base saturation. I may want to actually, maybe I should bale a little bit of that straw. You could remove something. It's not always a net benefit necessarily for the soil, but, when you start to look at your soil tests, and if you have access to cheap resources in the area, you can sometimes be a little creative and afford to lose something. So it's just,
Yeah, just like everything in organic, it's all context dependent and dependent on local resources and conditions. Just another question, you guys have touched on this a little bit. So transition is, the conditions are a bit different than after 3 years after the transition process. I mean, you're coming in with different weed seed bank dynamics, potentially some carryover effects of herbicides. Touched upon this a little bit. I mean, you have your soil tests are showing you different nutrient levels because of synthetic inputs. I'm just curious from the panel, with the need for cash flow and the need, the realities of markets, how do you think through the management of transition acres differently than your certified organic acres? Do you make different decisions in terms of what inputs you use, in terms of looking at cash flow or the cost of the inputs per acre, or do you basically manage those acres like you would your certified organic acres? Are there any decisions or thought processes that are different with the transition acres?
That's a good question. So, you know, if you've got kind of a core of acres that you're managing organically, there are a whole bunch of bottlenecks that come into that process, right? So the big one that I think about is grain storage, right? So if you're primarily an organic operation, you've got 500 acres, 1,000 acres, you're farming organically, it's likely if you have grain storage, you're kind of scaled to that, or as best you can, you know. And when you introduce another crop and you present some kind of logistic challenges with that, it can be a challenge in production, then it can be a challenge in handling or marketing, depending on what's around. And, you know, I don't think there are too many farms that just have an extreme excess of capacity in season when they're growing and cultivating organic crops. So if I've got 1,000 acres and I'm going to add 100 acres, I would really love it to match with my operations. You know, so if the guys are going to go cultivate soybeans here and that field is next to the field that is in soybeans, we may make a decision to say that field's going to follow that rotation. And we're going to figure out the marketing on the other side of it. Maybe it means we you know, sell it in a different way or something like that, or we line up trucking at the time. But it's between the difference between starting a farm up and growing the whole thing from no certified acres or adding acres has a big impact on that decision. Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, I think too that you got to think about the transition as this is a long-term plan. And I mean, if you're going to do this organic thing, just to do it for a few years, I can't understand that. And even though when we're listening to the marketing outlook and, you know, you hear that, it's like, but I think you have to think about this is a long-term thing. It's like anything that you put money in investments. If you keep pulling it every time the market goes down and then you put it in when, you know, you can't, it's got to be looked at that way. And so I look at the transition as economically, it's going to probably hurt, but it's a long-term deal and you're heading in the right direction. So I think it makes sense. You have to focus more on what you can do productively, operation-wise, during that time.
I'm just a weed question, I suppose. How many people? I'm curious what weeds you guys are experiencing primarily in your systems or in transition. Is foxtail? Is that your?
Yeah.
How many people? Big time foxtail. How about giant ragweed? Anything fun like jimson weed? Burr cucumber? Huh? Let's get, my buddy's right there. That's super helpful because one of the things that helped me kind of understand some of those considerations is some of the dynamics and the life cycles of those weeds and how long certain seeds can be persistent in the seed bank and what that can mean to, your production next year, the year after that, and what does it mean for our tools, what does it mean for our cover crops. We don't really have much of a pigweed or an amaranth problem on most of my farms because we have weed zappers and we have mowboard plows, and if we plow every third year and keep it down there and we don't have chisel plows. We don't really want to start stirring things up and changing our stratification. So, we just have a different community, and that community shifts as you manage it, and eventually we may get something that doesn't, we have to make another change again. I mean, it's a real challenge.
I'm not having a whole lot of thoughts come to mind on Aaron's question, but one thing that Taylor shared about storage had me think about how it was managed on the farm in Indiana. As I mentioned, it was kind of initially a slow transition, but then very rapid, right, in terms of the rest of the farm coming in. And so very quickly didn't have conventional acres to worry about. So that was nice from a parallel operation standpoint, right, having to deal with some of the clean out stuff. I mean, we still had to deal with a lot of it, and the record keeping was tremendous. Between the little bit of conventional acres, a lot of transition acres, a little bit of organic acres. But once more organic acres came online, the main grain facility at the home farm became dedicated to organic.
the reason being is that it was a big leg grain system, and the idea of the challenge we faced, I remember in the first year, is that some of that storage was for some conventional stuff, some was for transitional stuff, some was for organic, and we're moving stuff in and out of the leg and through the overhead, and the cleanouts just, it became, just a nightmare to deal with and to manage properly. And so that facility became dedicated, and then all the remote bins that we had on some of the owned farms, mainly leased farms, they're just in-out bins, right? And those all became storage for the transitional crops. And so we got kind of strategic about how we managed that so that we could minimize the headaches of cleanouts with that main grain lake facility, because it just was too much to manage. So, yeah.
This is my last question. I'll let you guys ask questions to each other that you've prepared. A lot of farmers, when they're thinking about transition initially, and this is where there's probably a little bit of a different challenge between starting those first acres of transition versus transitioning additional acres. Insects and diseases often aren't necessarily a huge challenge, but certainly weeds are, and the tools that organic farmer has in terms of ecology and steel are different than the chemical tools in the conventional farming sphere. Just curious, either from your own observations on your own land that you've managed or with the farmers that you've worked with, what are, in terms of prioritizing equipment or just prioritizing change in mindset? I mean, Taylor mentioned with a critical aspect of knowing what weeds you have and then how to manage around the ecology of those weeds. But just in terms of, as we're thinking of equipment or other aspects of timeliness of management, what are some of the, I think, major shifts in mindset that you've seen, that you've made or have seen farmers made that are needed as they transition from conventional to organic?
Well, it takes a lot more time. So just, compared to driving a sprayer, I'll say that. No. Yeah, I think that there's a timeliness component to it. So the number of passes, the amount of passes, or the intensity of them, and how critical they are and what your time windows can be when you're dealing with large acreage it can be pretty demanding. So, we try to set everything up just the way that we think is going to work best for us. Spend a lot of time preparing through the winter and getting everything tight and true and really good planning and preparation, and so we're not hitting the ground without any idea of what we're doing or how we want to lay out a field or plant a field, and then follow through with cultivation. But overall, we try to move quickly. I hate cultivating below about 4 miles an hour. It's just the absolute worst. So if I can be 5 mile an hour, I think we finished our last pass at around 7 last year, which may not be very fast for some of the high-speed cultivators, but with the ones we were running pretty tight to the crop, that feels like light speed. Early soybean cultivation at first trifoliate at 4 mile an hour you get a lot done really quickly, but you've got to have people that you trust and are capable, and you've got to have really good tools and an understanding of what it means, what is an acceptable loss and what is not. There's a management intensity around that, around verifying work done and understanding what that work looks like that isn't present in conventional production to the same extent. So, yeah.
And an overlapping of
process.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm, always struggling about what's the right balance of, labor and equipment investment, and always rethinking, and what is acceptable loss for, with what you've got, versus the additional investment and what are you going to gain? Is that going to make up for that? So that's where my mind shift is. I think I agree that the biggest challenge, a lot of the big challenges with all of this has to do with specialized equipment and labor. And there's a million different ways that you can go about even different machines or implements that you can have for weed control, and the best ones for your situation, and they're hard to know out of the gate. So you might as well just plan on having some trial and error years. And I know you only get one season at a time, but keep learning from that. And that's kind of where my mind shift is like, I just got to keep improving and keep learning. And I try to keep good records. And as much as I'd like everything to be perfect, it's not going to be. And the weather's not going to always, that too, that the weather is, Mother Nature, when you get into transition organic, plays a bigger role, I think, than when you're in a conventional situation.
There's a point, I think, around, and Angie hit on that there. There's all sorts of different ideas and things that can be done, and everyone has the best cultivator, and you've got to do this system, and you have to try that, and this will work, and you have no idea. You get that all the time, right? The best thing you can do is kind of look around, I think. But if you jump into transitioning a large acreage and you're trying to do some sort of a novel system or a novel rotation that you're not seeing people do successfully, that's pretty risky. I'm not saying it can't work, but if it's a particular crop that somebody thinks can work, or it's a different row spacing that some people think could work, or it's something that doesn't necessarily fit or function in the area, it's a gamble. So, I think looking around and seeing who's successful, what are they doing, how can I learn from those around me, that's a really important part of this.
I agree.
On this topic with tools and weed control, again, I'm going to lean pretty heavily on my experience from working at Living Prairie Family Farms, and I recognize a number of faces in here, and we had the luxury of also operating a equipment business, which still exists, Living Prairie Equipment. So as that farm was getting retooled, he took on that business it became a dealer for a number of manufacturers for the tools that he needed. So selling Limken equipment, Einbach, Weed Zapper, Hinneker, Salford, on and on. So we had access to a huge set of tools, and could often get access to some of the newer cultivators and various types of cultivating equipment before other folks, or at least have ready access to it, demo machines, et cetera. But I think the things that stood out for me is that, you don't need it all. We had the luxury of having access to a lot of different tools on this farm. But more importantly is understanding how to use them and making sure that the people operating them are executing well.
Training somebody.
To get around to all these acres that were in cultivation with employees and seeing that when they get to the field that they're setting and running properly, we couldn't. But it's crucially important to make sure that they're executing properly, because they could get across 160 acres, 200, whatever, however many acres in a day with that piece. If it wasn't set right and the job's not being executed properly, or the soil conditions weren't right for how it was set, you got something out of it, but a lot of that potential is lost, right? You're setting yourself up for more challenges down the road. So timeliness really became, the importance of early execution of operations became extremely clear to me over time working with this farm in Indiana. Took kind of a lackadaisical approach to blind cultivation early. And that's changed. It's getting tighter, it's getting better, hitting with tine weeder with rotary hose. Sort of took it easy. And I think some of that was this pink cloud effect, I think, that you experience in transition, where maybe very well managed conventional operation, didn't have a high weed seed bank, those years in transition, first couple years organic, look good.
You.
Yeah. And so it's I only need to make one blind cultivation pass, or I don't need to make a blind cultivation pass on this one, and getting fooled by the idea that if I don't see the weeds, I'm not going to worry about it. But over time, seeing how that can really compound and create problems. So I think
blind cultivation, executing early, and when those weather windows present themselves, you have to take advantage. And are you at the scale where you can get across all the acres? And I think that that's been a learning process, knowing what size of equipment you need, how many people you need. And so the last point I was going to make about this is, do you have the people? Can you hire the people who can do this job and show up and work the hours they need to work, especially in that early part of the season, to get across these acres? And that was a challenge for Jason. We shifted to having we just could not find the consistent help locally to be in tractors, to execute the way we needed them, to be, physically fit, to be sober, and so that farm has shifted. While I was there, we started hiring guys on the H-2A program, bringing them from South Africa, and that continues. We'd love to support people and employ people locally, but we can't get the job done that way.
In terms of transitioning acres, and those are some of the same observations I've seen, as much as kind of deciding what crops are going to help cash flow, what crops are going to help with improving soil condition. The pink cloud, I hadn't heard of that phrase, but I think it's often farmers, again, think that the weeds are going to immediately hit when they transition, but there's this kind of a grace period oftentimes after transitioning from conventional, because the weed seed bank might be less. But as much as, again, looking at crops or inputs, understanding, do you have the people and the equipment to cover the acres you're transitioning, and to be able to understand that, okay, that first year in transition, you might only have X amount of weeds escape, but they're going to produce millions of seeds that if you don't manage effectively early, it's going to come back to bite you once you're in, and that's when you really want to see that cash flow with the premium. So really thinking through, do I have the people, do I have the labor, do I have the equipment to be able to effectively manage those acres that are being brought on board to weed management?
I'll just make one comment about the labor too, and this and training people and having, people like to, including me, want to have, here's the plan, and we're going to follow this plan, and this is how it's going to go. And every year is different, and that is where, when you have people that work for you and they think, okay, this is the path we're going to follow. So there has to be this, training involved, and is like, we're just going to have to always reassess. We're going to have to look at what's going on, and we're going to always have to be willing to be flexible and vary the plan.
So I know you guys thought of questions for each other. I want to make sure if there's questions that you guys want to ask. Or
We're okay.
Okay. Anyone have, and just have a discussion and troubleshooting with the whole group as well.
I'll ask a question. So what's been the most profitable way to transition your land, and which system do you like the best of the thing?
Well, I'll just say again, I talked quite a bit about the different strategies we used at Living Prairie Family Farm, and I think every farm, it's just so context specific. We had access to markets that had great basis and premiums on non-GMO that were 20 minutes away, right? So growing non-GMO soybeans in transition was just phenomenal. And that first year, typically, the weed control was really easy. And then we got real lucky on a lot of the acres transition with oats because of the timing that we hit with the market. I love growing oats. I love what it does in the transition and stuff, but in terms of ready access to markets for where that farm is in Indiana, not a lot of food grade options that are close. It's mostly selling to feed mills and Amish communities and hoping that the price was good, So, yeah, I spoke to the different strategies that kind of depended on the markets that we had access to, and hitting some things that were out of our control that helped. So I don't know that there's any one way about it.
I wish there was a transition label.
Yeah,
Because, and I know they talked about it at one point, but essentially this is an organic product. It's, unlike, it's not a non-GMO bean. It is more than that. So it would be nice if there was a premium for that.
Yeah, I like the soybean deal. Specialty soybean, small grain, cover crop, and then have a really hot first year. You know, spend a little bit of those years where your opportunity cost of those acres is lower, right? Because the next crop you could sell is not going to be worth as much as that corn crop. Set yourself up and really hit it hard.
If you're going to do that, again, be careful with the idea of a first year, you know, roller crimp rye, no-till bean, if you have intention of doing a second year small grain, especially for a food grade market. It's just problematic. I've seen it time and time again. I mean, there's ways you can manage it. You could go through when that stuff's headed out. Typically, the rye is the tallest. You could go through with like a topper, you know, when it's at anthesis or whatever, and cut those rye heads out. But it can be a problem. I mean, the way some of those acres were transitioned with no-till beans and then a volunteer rye crop that we were able to market for cover crop seed, those acres were no-till all the way through transition. I mean, planted the rye no-till following the last conventional crop, no-tilled the soybeans, volunteer rye the second year, frost-seeded clover alfalfa. And then we come into that first year organic. Some of those acres were even strip-tilled popcorn. And so that's pretty unique to see, you know, a full transition in no-till. But, you know, those fields, some of those fields, we saw some interesting results in that first year organic popcorn, where I think our carbon to nitrogen balance was out of whack because of just this rye on rye. And we probably really needed to up the nitrogen that we gave to that crop, because I think the rye, you know, that first year no-till bean where we rolled the rye down, that mat was still there come the first year organic. Some of that rye was still there because we had a second year rye crop, right? So just tons of carbon. And I think that the carbon and nitrogen balance in that soil, we saw some pretty poor results on some of those fields.
Go ahead.
One thing I think you might want to, or it's a good thing to address to the group, especially people that are looking to transition, about the crop insurance.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You're gonna lose your awesome APH, you have your conventional field, you got 210 APH, you're gonna go to 129. Your price you're gonna put on there is gonna be conventional pricing, not organic.
Yeah. Yeah, so just be aware of the crop insurance implications through transition. Any thoughts from the panel in terms of crop insurance?
It really sucks.
Yeah, when you buy land and you're in a new area, you start over anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, though. There are different agents have different levels of understanding of organic programs, just like different lenders have different understanding of organic programs, and even looking at different FSA offices have different understanding of where there's opportunity with organic programs. So I know there's areas that are, I think, a little bit more blessed in terms of people with that knowledge, but it is important to shop around and just realize that it's worth talking to different people and getting different perspectives, because they're having people that are knowledgeable in terms of what are the options of organic is really important.
Yeah, I'm no expert on crop insurance, but one thing that we did have to navigate as the farm became more diversified, and I'm even experiencing with the farm in New York right now, is that a lot of the crops that we pursued weren't covered in that county, and we had to go through the process to get that crop covered. Well, popcorn was covered in that county, has a history in that county, but things like we brought oilseed sunflower into the rotation, we did canola for a bit. The farm in New York right now, spring wheat is not a covered crop, and so we have to work with our insurance agent and work with the CCA to get a letter and provide all the cropping history, and so that we can get coverage on some of these diversified crops.
Do we have a question?
I'm curious, so you talked about like that grace period of the weeds, I hadn't heard about that.
Mm-hmm.
What about if you need to rescue a field that has been kind of gone out of control?
You mean maybe gone?
During transition or
No,
after
when
transition?
you're taking over.
Acres that are
Okay.
already
So I
weedy?
know when it's a transition,
Sure.
I'm saying,
What-
say we're transitioning a weedy field.
What kind of weeds?
Right.
Because that'll dictate Like what species?
Canada thistle.
Oh, boy. Okay.
All the
Yeah,
bad ones.
you have the
Like,
fun
think
ones.
of the worst weeds,
Right.
Yeah.
and then think of like a lot of them.
Oh, yeah.
Like, do you have, like,
Smother.
what would you do?
So we deal with Johnson grass and some really weird viney stuff down on the Texas farm. So it's a 60-inch rainfall environment. We have they have a palmer population. It doesn't seem to be a problem for us yet. We'll see. Man, oh man, Canada thistle that's a rough one.
Smother it.
I've kind of wondered if there couldn't be, frankly, I don't know if I've ever seen anyone do this. I always thought a rod weeder would work really well with Canada thistle. And yeah, rod weeder,
is
like
that?
they use, so rod weeder, it's,
Zapper?
no, it's typically used in drier climates for, used to be used before chemical fallow became a thing.
I mean, is that like a quack digger?
No,
No,
it's,
different.
so a rod
It's
weeder
just
is
a
very
rod.
specific. It's a driven rod. So they can be PTO driven or ground driven. They're common in Kansas and the Dakotas, and it creates a dust mulch. So when you're doing your yearly fallow, it's a steel square bar that runs a couple inches under the soil, and it rotates usually backwards, like very quickly. And I always thought that would work if the soil wasn't too tight to help yank up some of the roots maybe and stick them on top. Because it's a similar thing where with quack grass or with Johnson grass, you got to get those roots, the rhizomes or whatever, up to die. And so there's a tillage side to it, but I'd also want to look at your soils, your soil samples, and think about fertility.
I guess this is probably heretical. I'm going to throw it out there that I'd question why there is in a conventional system so many weeds and whether or not it's worth to delay transition a year.
Existing
And get rid of, I know, is it existing
Yeah,
organic?
existing
I think that's
organic,
a little different, like taking over existing organic that is already weedy versus trying to fix those problems ahead of time with a
Maybe go back
bigger
to conventional
toolbox.
for a little bit.
I mean, this could pertain
to
to
say
even
that.
like as we see some CRP come out.
Sure.
And people
Oh, boy.
want to transition CRP immediately to
Yeah.
organic.
Right.
I mean, this isn't just,
No, I think that's probably more of an equivalent situation to taking CRP out of production.
So, see, this is not the climate-friendly option, I think.
I know.
But
Right.
CRP, I think about the best thing you could do if you were transitioning CRP is to burn it and then plow it. I think that we've plowed it, or we bush hogged it and plowed it before, and then you end up with a mat underneath there. You end up with roots. You end up with all this stuff that you fight for a couple of years of cultivation. But yeah, I think there's probably some unusual creative options that you've got to chase after.
Yeah, I don't, Canada thistle, have seen some of that come into the farm in Indiana and, tried some different strategies. And it's a long-term game. It's a long play of how to manage it. I don't think it's not complete elimination. It's going to be management, I think. But playing with barley, winter barley, at
Yeah.
least for where that farm sits, the timing of when the Canada thistle is at that bud, early flower,
Right.
which is optimal timing for cutting it to try to deplete some of the carbohydrate reserves in those rhizomes, is right when that barley is typically being cut. And then following that with a double crop or a multi-species cover crop, sorghum sedan, get it
that's a great
smothered.
idea.
But even looking at some of those acres, putting together an arrangement with some of the big organic dairies to the north that could come and chop and just putting in alfalfa for several years and using it strategically.
We had luck with a forage chain mix. I had some Canada thistle in New Jersey in some fields, and we were grazing them primarily, intensive grazing. And then Sudex was great. We'd come back in a fast cycle, and we were moving them every day, so a lot of animal impact, and it couldn't handle it. Virginia, I had a similar thing with some river bottom ground that I put into pasture, and I had I wasn't growing grain there, but we were doing a Sudex and annual ryegrass crimson clover kind of rotation, and same thing. I hit it and beat it up pretty well with a disc before planting each time, but that along with that intensive grazing it knocked it back seriously.
And I think it's rainfall and soil specific, but I do wonder about a lot of the use and adoption of
High-speed discs.
high-speed discs as primary tillage tools in organic operations, compounding our problems with Canada thistle, dandelion, things like that. We're chopping, mixing, and creating a perfect place for those rhizomes and root pieces to propagate.
The Germans use a tool that looks like a Thai paratill subsoiler to get rid of Canada thistle. So like a paratill, I think it's a paratill. it kind of has a sweeping angle, so it has a lifting component deeper down to the subsoil. So it's like a straight shank subsoiler, but it has much more aggressive action underneath. So I think that there's some ties to compaction.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great suggestions, but yeah, looking at not chopping, but instead lifting and drawing those up. I think we could probably take, Chris, you had a question, then we'll probably.
Just a comment, so great discussion in terms of, having specificity in terms of, what species you're trying to target with your weed control. A great resource that came out a year or two ago, it's free, it's a book from SARE, Managing Weeds on Your Farm. And that book, basically, you species by species, different weeds, if you understand the biology of, how to manage it, you can really tackle it. So just want to plug that in terms of a great resource you should check out. There's also the different tools you can use, 400 to 500 pages long, lots of great information.
And free. A lot of these SARE publications, which are wonderful, if you want to purchase a hard copy, which I know many of you do, then and it's not that expensive, but there's a lot of free downloads that you could put on your tablet or so. Great free read. That's a great suggestion, Chris.
Can you believe it? A panel on transition, and here we are talking about weeds.
It's the name of the game.
Every organic session.
All right. Well, we must.
I just wanted to say one quick thing. One, I guess, trap that I've seen some people early or getting into organic, transitioning, whatever, is kind of the weed zapper trap. Just the idea that this tool, this strategy is a key component to your weed management system is, I think, a dangerous one. I've seen a lot of people think that this is going to be my cure-all. This is my substitute for the sprayer. And approaching your weed management system from that standpoint is not.
It's a recipe.
It's a bad.
It can get you to harvest for sure. It's a great tool, and a lot of fun to run, right? But yeah, if you're at the point where you're there, you've got some other things you can do ahead of time. Yeah.
Is there a quick comment? We need to.
Well, and this is more of a comment on the sociological aspects of transitioning large acres. I became an organic farmer in 1974 when there was no transition. You just declared yourself and you were. And then I acquired a farm in 1978. But it was a small farm, and with arranging it as an intentional community, we were able to own the farm within 5 years. Mm-hmm. And that was the best thing that ever happened. That was the transition.
Right.
Because I didn't have to worry about market prices and such. And the purpose, I think, of organic and what we were thinking about in those days was in that era, conventional agriculture was getting bigger and bigger units. And in the county I lived in, this was a county in central Kansas of 35, 40 miles, it started in the late 80s, people talking about we can go to 300, and they even used the word operator rather than farmer. 300 farmers, 2,500 acre units of production. And it dawned on me, here I've raised 3 kids. I lived in this community for 50 years. How are you going to have a school?
Right.
How are you going to have a main street? How are you going to have any infrastructure for the people?
Yeah.
Because you'll basically have 300 operators, and then you will have, a bunch of laborers.
Yeah.
But see, their kids aren't going to want to be probably that.
Yeah.
And it goes to an incredibly large problem that we have in rural America, in that the ability to be a long-term person with ownership and legacy is being undermined.
Yeah,
It has been undermined. I mean, I watched it in conventional agriculture all through the 70s, a vacation of all the homes.
Yeah.
And it was basically the land is now owned by absentee landlords. And then I believe Belltown Farms is a UK-based thing, is it?
No.
We do have to
No.
break, so it's an interesting discussion. One thing I will note about some of the larger scale organic farms that I've had the pleasure of working with, a lot of them, and one of the reasons why they're transitioning is because they support multiple family members and multiple generations, which is a big issue with farm transition in general. But a lot of these farms, there's cousins in the operation and nephews and multiple family members. So scale is a tough thing because it's hard to say is scale a corporate scale or is scale a single operator or is scale essentially supporting 20 family members. So, but it is definitely a crucial discussion, I think, of an ag policy. We only have 5 minutes still to get over, so I'm cutting off the discussion. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for your discussion.